I'm your host Ambika from ThreeFish Consulting. ThreeFish Webinar is our endeavor to bring world-class thinking in the areas of talent management and leadership development to our community of clients, partners and well-wishers. Before we begin, a few instructions. On your screen, you will find a questions box. You can send in your questions to me there and we will address them towards the end of the webinar. If you face any technical issues during the webinar, send a message to the chat box or text me. This webinar will be recorded and will be available on our website before the weekends at threefish.in. With this, I would like to begin the webinar and introduce you to our presenters today. Gus McIntosh is the CEO of Winsboro Limited and a leading psychologist based in New Zealand. He has been using 360 development surveys for CEOs, CXOs, top team development globally. He has recently designed and successfully launched a research-based 360 tool, LSP 360, which can also predict impact of leader behavior on employee engagement. We also have Pradnya Parashar, CEO of ThreeFish Consulting. She designed her first leadership 360 survey in 1995 and in the last 20 years has used them extensively for leadership development. An accomplished industrial organizational psychologist, Pradnya has extensive experience in strategic HR, executive coaching and leadership development. Over to you, Pradnya.
Great. Well, thanks a lot, Ambika, and Gus, welcome, and thanks for joining us on the ThreeFish webinars. For our participants and our listeners, you're in listen-only mode, and as Ambika said, keep sending in your questions through the chat box. Ambika will collect them and we'll pause towards the end to make sure we'll get through as many questions as we can. Quickly in terms of the agenda, I'm going to open up with just a little bit of context setting in terms of what are we really talking about when we talk about 360 feedback survey. And then I'm going to hand it over to Gus to really share with us Winsboro's experience using 360, not just in New Zealand, but also internationally as they've worked with their global clients. We're going to follow this up with a discussion around a few key dilemmas that we almost always stumble upon or seem to wander into whenever we're implementing 360 feedback. So both Gus and I will share our views and our experiences and our perspectives on a couple of these key dilemmas. After that, we'll pause for audience Q&A. This is when we'll start answering questions that we would have received from you. Before wrapping up, I want to also give everyone a quick look at the ThreeFish Leadership 360 survey that we have developed in partnership with Winsboro and that we're beginning to use with our clients in India. And then we're going to summarize and end with a quick summary as well as some best practice sharing. So that's really how our next hour is going to be spent. So just quickly moving forward, there are many ways we know in which feedback can be collected. Whether it's for talent management, whether it's for development. For those of you who are executive coaches, you're probably also collecting stakeholder feedback through an interview process. But when we talk about 360, we're really talking about a process of collecting, quantifying, and reporting observations about individuals from co-workers. And when we refer to co-workers, we're really also referring over here to the managers, the peers, the direct reports, as well as other key stakeholders of that individual. The process itself is a questionnaire-based methodology, and it provides assessment of the individual, which is a numerical assessment, and that's what allows us to have comparison between rater groups. So questionnaire and numerical are the two key elements over here. Along with that is confidentiality. Confidentiality of the data gets better preserved when the process itself is an online process. The 360 survey process that we talk about provides a three-dimensional holistic picture of the individual, which typically helps drive individual behavioral changes. What's possible over here is behaviors that are valued by the organization can then be targeted for change and for development. And finally, when used appropriately, a 360 feedback survey process can be used not only for development, but also for individual decision making and at an organizational level to set up some organizational change priorities. So broadly speaking, when we think about application of the 360 process, we're usually or most typically seeing it being used for individual development, whether it's employee development, leadership development, succession planning and development, or in many of the organizations for high potential talent development. But 360s can and have been used effectively also at organizational change initiatives, such as team building. When you're trying to build solid, high-performing teams, sometimes a 360 survey is a very non-intrusive, confidential, and very robust way of soliciting feedback from each other and from team members and bringing it alive and bringing it back to the team so that they can begin to work on the foundations of building a solid team. Also, as part of organizational change and development, if certain competencies are targeted for development, then the 360 survey can help create a baseline to see where are we currently and therefore can very nicely begin to inform learning and developmental interventions. So as I was saying, both individual as well as organizational applications is how we see this 360 being applied. At this point, I'm going to actually make Gus our presenter and invite him to start sharing with us some of his experiences and his perspectives as they have worked with 360s with their clients. So Gus, let's make sure this is working, and I'm going to hand it over to you as your presenter, as a presenter. Right. Yeah, and I can see your screen.
Super.
Yes, and in a slideshow mode. Done.
Fantastic. First of all, it's just I really appreciate the opportunity to speak to everyone over there. And it's interesting sort of seeing some of the differences in the way that different organizations and different environments pick up on the use of 360 and how they apply it for their own particular context. So first of all, I think for me it's about understanding, as Pradnya said, it's the why. Why are we doing it in the first place? So if you bear with me, just a couple of slides on that context, and then I'll dive into a little bit about how we use them and our experience in it. So the piece here is about reputation versus identity, and it's a really important distinction that leaders really need to understand the difference around. And often when we are coaching people, as I'm sure a number of you do, it's about how to help someone understand how they are seen by others, which is the reputation piece, versus how they consider themselves as a leader, which is identity. And fundamentally, I think that's about the audience's view versus the actor's view. So when you're standing on the stage presenting a play to the audience, they may receive you in a different way from how you think you are coming across to them. And that matters. I think the best way that I've talked about this as an analogy is the American Idol, which I know you have an Indian version of that's probably been running for a number of years. We certainly have a New Zealand version of it, and we all kind of know the format, right, which is about someone who is like a Simon Cowell version, who is very tough and is able to sort of call it how they see it. And then you have all of the people that are participating in that, and they are presenting what they believe are their gifts and skills to the world. But as we know, there's a bit of a difference, and I think it is often revealed in the sense of this reputation and identity. The individual is there and they are singing their heart out and they honestly believe that they're doing a marvelous job. And then you have the Simon Cowell version whoever that is in the Indian Idol, and they call it how it is. They absolutely say, look, I think it's appalling, or it was really bad, or I didn't enjoy it. And you can see sometimes the disconnect between the singer and how they receive that feedback, which is the difference between reputation versus identity. And I think for sequential thing is about reputation. In a work sense, the promotions, the people who want to work with us, the salary rise, the people who want to partner with us, all of those sort of things are based on reputation. It's whether they want to do that for us, not whether we want to do it. And this kind of matters because for leaders, that makes the difference in some very consequential ways. So if we think about that from a work perspective, you have, I think, three things. They're all interrelated, as we know, but a big one is if you have a poor reputation as a leader at work, you may not know about it and people might not tell you, but there are things that happen as a result. The first one, I think, that is very salient is the fact that staff engagement drops. The people that are reporting to us, if we don't have a very good leader reputation, they tend to start becoming disengaged. And the contribution between that and higher staff turnover is fairly obvious and well documented. People will leave their jobs the less engaged they are. And secondly, even if they stay, the productivity becomes far lower. So there is a very real cost implication for this reputation element. And we've all seen the impact. We know about the notion of people leaving their bosses and tending to decide to disconnect even if they're there, and the implication that that has in a work sense. So it's not just theory, it's very real. A big part of what we all do, I guess, in the leadership perspective and the development sector is about trying to build insight into leader reputation. So helping leaders understand what is it that they do and how is that received by other people. And it occurs to me there's lots of ways of doing this, but there's three main ones that we're probably aware of. The first is direct feedback. So that is the conversational piece. And it relies on both parties to A, want to sit down, and B, have a productive conversation with each other. The second is using personality assessment to kind of reveal that in a little bit more of a structured framework. We use the Hogan assessments. We're the distributor for that in New Zealand, and there are lots of different assessments out there, but in my personal opinion, Hogan is one of the better ones for its ability to interrogate and really get to the heart of how people operate and behave. And it's a really useful tool, personality assessment, to reveal that insight for others. The third, as we know, is around 360-degree feedback. And I'll get into the difference between these in a moment, but understanding that those are often the three fundamental ways. So let's talk about New Zealand for a moment. I think in terms of the translating what we know here. Now, as Pradnya said, we operate globally, so we distribute 360s and do things in a global sense. So we've got a lot of experience outside New Zealand, but where we started was in New Zealand, and it was really interesting in the way that we have adapted and evolved to meet the particular context here. So a little bit of context for you. Some of you may have been here, but in New Zealand it is a very small village. I was looking at it the other day. I think the population of New Zealand is 1/5 the size of New Delhi. So we could fit 5 New Zealands just in Delhi alone, which is just are too nice. But that just gives you a default of how your style and how you operate. And the third piece there, and I think it is a really good bridge for linking the other two up and connecting them, is the 360. It is common for managers and leaders, and it really does complement the other two. And for that reason, this is our experience of 360s, right, is a useful point to understand. The anonymity of 360s, the fact that people can rate and respond without knowing where their comments are coming from or the person that they're going to, is really good because it offsets that indirect feedback culture that we have. The second piece there is you can have really good insights by showing how personality that might be driven out of a personality assessment or that might be a little bit theoretical, how it impacts in their given context, so how it actually relates in their job. The third piece there is about tracking leader development over time, and it's sometimes really hard to do this. What mechanisms do you have? But a 360 is really good at that. And the fourth point there is actually really important. We've only worked this out, I think, over the years that we've been doing it, but how you show the results really matters. The number of 360 that I've seen that are just a kind of a 30 pages or thereabouts of averages and bar charts that don't really mean anything, and it's really problematic. So that's right. Just the first way, understanding that we use the domain model across all of our 360s. Pradnya will talk about this in a moment with the ThreeFish 360, but it is these four buckets really. Sort of at a domain level, there are four areas of leadership performance, and that's emotional restraint, managing pressure and stress, how you respond to difficult situations. Secondly, and then the fourth there is how you think and plan. So just understanding that model is useful for what I'm about to show you. Here's an example of linking personality. So you may or may not be familiar with the Hogan assessments. The top piece there that I'm showing you is the Hogan personality inventory, and it doesn't really matter too much what the scales are, but what you can see there is this particular individual is lower on the scales of ambition and sociability and interpersonal sensitivity, higher on prudence. What that really means is they don't project themselves in a very overt way. They're sort of a little bit quieter, not quite as dominant, and they are quite organized and structured. That's the prudence scale. So imagine giving feedback to that individual, and it's kind of theoretical. It's sort of saying this is how your style is. But when you combine that with a 360, you can start to show the individual the impact that is having in their particular environment. So if you look at the how they lead piece down there, they're quite low on that comparatively. And it starts to make a lot of sense, right? It's like the way that there's no rights or wrongs to personality, but the way that you are behaving is having an impact in your particular environment in this particular way. Really powerful insight that's really useful for a leader, not to change their personality or behavior, but to change or rather not to change their personality or style, but to change the behavior and the way that they go about getting the job done. The second piece here is moving that insight to development. So this is the same individual, and what's really cool to see here is that light grey head and then the sort of darker blue head represent pre-program and post-program. So this individual had two lots of 360s. And the first one was how they performed the first time round, and as we saw, it was a little bit lower. But when you look at the second time round, you can see how much they've improved. And this is not about changing personality, but it's about their ability to understand how to use their own style and impact to really make a difference. So that had, I think it's a really neat context to personality to context, that insight, and then also the insight of being able to understand how and where to develop and being able to see it in real time like we're looking at now. And this individual was part of a program. So what I'm showing you now is actually the whole cohort. We've been running this program for a large company, technical focus, they're in local government. It's a 6-month leadership development program, and we've been running it for a couple of years. What you can see there is the difference that the leadership program has had in a kind of before and after state. So this has been really useful for the organisation to be able to understand the return on investment that has occurred. And you can see that it hasn't made a little bit, but not so much impact on how you behave there, but not a huge amount. There's a little increase about how you think and plan, but not again a huge amount. But where it's really had impact is in their relationships. This is leaders' relationships with each other and key stakeholders, and it's particularly and that's incredibly useful for the organisation to be able to start understanding that ROI. The next piece I just want to talk about quickly is an innovation that we have brought to 360s, and we're quite proud of this. I think, as I said before, what I see in a lot of 360s is just the bar charts and average scores. But actually, when you think about it, there's a lot of good information there that you can extract. And so we are really lucky to have access to huge amounts of people that are doing both 360s, doing engagement surveys, doing personality assessment. And so when we stop and look at that, we can start to see a and the context for this is the following. So we all know, right, and this is nothing new to you, but organizational change is fast. It is just rapid these days, and it's exponential. It's just moving so quickly. But we also know that human change is slow. Behavior, coaching, development, it's not exponential. It's hard graft, and it takes effort and time. So it's slow. But what prediction does is it allows us to overcome the lag. So the quicker we can predict what's going to happen in 6 or 12 months, the sooner the leader can react. And a lot of times 360s are a backward view of how performance or how the person's gone. But actually what this is doing is it's forward now and predict the future, and allowing the leader as a result of that to respond before anything happens. So here's the relationship that we found with certain items. There's a little algorithm in here that's about not across the whole survey, but there's a little group of questions that seem to have a really strong connection with staff engagement. And you can see that sort of linear relationship there. We call it the Q index. It's actually named after our psychometrician, which is a combination of a statistician and a psychologist, very smart people. We have one of those internally. Her name is Quinn, so that's where the Q index comes from, if you're wondering. But here's the outcome of that, and this is very cool to see. So what we're doing here is we've got an algorithm now that allows us to predict staff engagement based on the 360 results. When we categorize someone as having, and this is the algorithm, but if we categorize them as having a high Q index, you can see there that the chances are they're going to have about 84% of engagement in their team. If you have a moderate Q index, that's going to drop down to around half of the team will be engaged. And you can see there when you've got a low Q index, that drops dramatically down to only 4% of people being engaged. So an example of that is we had an organisation that had just done some engagement survey, like a big organisational survey, and we were looking across the senior team. They had a high level of engagement in the direct reports to the senior team, so it looked positive. But at the same time, we were doing the 360s, and the 360s weren't too bad, but the engagement, the Q index was quite low. And so what that kind of told us is, despite the engagement being pretty good, over time, over 6 to 12 months, we were going to see a drop in staff engagement. And lo and behold, that's exactly what happened. So now that we know that, it's the ability to get in front of that conversation and say, hey, look, this is what's going to happen. This is what's going to play out over the next 6 to 12 months. And so getting in there before the attitudinal change, before the engagement drops, because once it does drop, once engagement drops, it's very hard, as you know, to get it back. So that's a really neat little piece, and I think it's about sort of transforming, as I say, the data that we've got into something that is thinking forward and a bit more meaningful. So what I thought, there's a couple of points that I'd like to make about 360s in India, and the way that I see, having worked and lived there and worked and lived in New Zealand, and how that might be applicable. You will know the environment far better than I do, but so there's 4 things in here. I think that the power distance is a really interesting one. So as I said, in New Zealand, we've got a very indirect feedback because we're too nice. We're worried about when am I going to see this person again, and that prevents us being as open. What I saw in India when I was working there, and you will have a better sense of this than I do, but there's a very strong kind of respect for hierarchies and power. So whether you are in charge, whether you are the boss, or whether you are the manager type thing. And I think in the same way that can restrict a little bit of that open feedback culture. It's not common for an employee to wander up to the boss and go, hey look, I'd just like to give you some feedback on how you've been performing, and some of it is critical. You know, it's harder to imagine that happening. So for the exact same reason as we are too nice, and in India there's a little bit of this power distance between employee and manager, 360s are a really good way of getting around that, because the anonymity in a 360 allows the leader to gain that insight, but not create pressure or stress on the individual that is providing it. So I think that's a really, really neat little opportunity. The second point there, I think, is that 360s can really act as a bridge in your environment to connecting that personality to the leader impact. The same way that we found in New Zealand, being able to the personality assessment and the small bits of conversational feedback to how is that style really playing out on the people around you. So that combination of using assessment, using good coaching and development conversations, but also having the 360 and their real strong bridge to linking the 3 together. The third point, I think, is that it's sort of just understanding that personality really about identifying potential, and that's really useful, but it's also good for leaders to understand, well, how am I going right now in my particular context, and that I think is the 360, because it is sort of talking more about performance in a way. And the fourth point, I think, is, again, it is very difficult, I think, in HR and OD to track leader development. We often apply programs, we apply coaching, and we've got an instinct around, but it's very hard to measure it. And lo and behold, 360s are actually a really effective mechanism for being able to do that. So using a pre and post, we're doing more and more of those now, and I think partly that's because of the ability to demonstrate that ROI both for the individual and for the organisation. And so I think there's an opportunity in India for doing that as well, because it just provides a little bit more of a tangible nature to tracking leader development. So there you go. It was just a quick wander through how we are using 360s, a little bit of my experience around using 360s, and then also I think that where I see the opportunity, having been exposed to a little bit of the 2 environments, having lived and worked there, you will be able to translate that far better than I can in terms of what works and what doesn't. But there is, I think, similarities that we can utilise to make sure that leader development piece works really well for 360s. So thank you very much for your time, and I'll pass back over to Pradnya now for the discussion.
Great. Wonderful. Thank you. Thanks a ton. Thank you so much, Gus. Especially, you've left us with some really good insights and some thoughts around 360 work in an Indian context. What I want to take us now is really begin to look at some of these 2-3 questions, Gus, as we started working on this, and we said, we always seem to stumble upon when we get into development around 360s, right? So the first question really, and I want to maybe open up by asking this to you, and it always comes up, so 360, should we use them for development only, or can we use it for talent management and for decisions? So what's been sort of your view, perspective, practice around it, Gus?
It's a really good question. We've thought about it a lot at our end at both. Where we've got to, I think more recently, is a little bit more of a recommendation about more using it for development, trying to keep it as a bit more of a pure tool. I think there are benefits for using it for decision making, whether that's promotions or performance conversations and so forth and whatnot. But I think there are risks attached to that as well. There's an underlying consequence, I think, that changes the way people respond. And so I think an example for me is that, if I want to get a bonus, and to do so I know that you have to rate me positively, there's a very easy connection there or step for me to go, well, if I rate you positively, then you're more likely to reciprocate. And it might be subtle, but I think what it does is it sort of changes the nature of the feedback. You can't rely quite so strongly on the purity of it. So if you do that, I think it's really important to have very tight communication around it, very tight program around it, so that people are very clear about what happens with the information and how to use it. But if you were to do that kind of in an ad hoc way, I think it's quite risky in our experience.
Yeah, no, I completely agree with you. And in fact, that's been an ongoing dilemma for years. And I will say, I've struggled with it as I've practiced, and I've brought it into organizations where I work. In a recent article, though, that was published by PsyOp, which is the Society for IO Psychology, they've kind of put a bit of a definitive stake in the ground on that, where they've said, of course, 360s can be used for talent management decisions. Of course, they can also be used a little bit in the performance assessment realm, really more to support judgments or decisions around the how of the performance. There's a what, which is the goals, but how was that performance achieved? And of course, the responsibility for performance assessment is always with the manager, and I think it's not, no one can step away from that. But this becomes additional data points, perhaps to support more the how rather than the what. Clearly in succession planning, developmental conversations, talent management, it can be used. And they do go on to say, though, that the caveat is exactly as you were saying, and a little beyond that, to say it does need to be a well-designed, reliable, and validated survey. It can be an off-the-shelf survey. It doesn't need to be a custom survey. But what's important is it reliable? Is it valid? Because that's the only way you can ensure fairness, especially if you're using it for talent management. And the other piece around that is, if you're using it for talent management, then make sure everybody at that level is going through this as a program. So going back to what you're saying, look at it programmatically, and not just singling out one or two individuals or so-called problem people where you're now trying to get additional data, because I think that's where then there's a lot more risk around trust issues and also how the data is being used and all that comes into play. So I think for me in my own practice, and as we've been working with our clients, we're beginning to move towards using the 360 data to support some of the talent decisions, but doing it in a more well thought out programmatic manner. That's where we're beginning to move.
That's exactly right, and that's exactly how we've been using it too, Pradnya. We've had some big programs where we've used it in a talent mapping capacity, and that has resulted in sort of decisions, and it was well known about how that was being used. And I think your point about can use it in both environments, absolutely. and it just requires, in the latter one, because it's a little bit more delicate, it requires a lot more rigor around doing it programmatically and systematically and having all of the good comms around it. But you know, if you're able to achieve all of those, then it's a really useful tool in both.
Yeah, absolutely. Which takes me to sort of the second question that, or second dilemma that often comes up, which is off-the-shelf versus custom. So maybe I want to start off with a little bit of my point of view that I've developed over the years. And I've been, as an HR director, I've used custom surveys, I've put energy into using them, building them. I've been part of, you know, so I've used both. I've also used, worked with clients who had their own custom surveys, and then there have been programs where we've used more sort of off-the-shelf surveys. Where I'm landing more and more, Gus, is that I think it's really a choice between where an organization wants to invest their energy and their effort. Because building a custom survey requires a lot, it's very resource intensive, and so you're putting in a lot of energy and effort into it. And I'm kind of beginning to feel that I don't see a whole lot of ROI in building a custom survey unless you're really working with large numbers. I think the ROI is really limited when you're dealing with small numbers. Instead, I recommend to clients, put your energy in the programmatic elements. Put your energy in creating value for the people, because the 360 is only a tool and it gives you data, but the real work begins after you've got the data. So, you know, use that energy and put it more into deriving value out of the data. I do say, though, get a good consulting partner to work with you. Someone who has built a valid, reliable instrument, and not just someone who's just throwing some items together, but really has looked at it psychometrically, put some energy behind it, but is also a thinking partner with you who's helping you think about the 360 as a program, and think about it holistically versus just kind of buying an off-the-shelf tool. So that's really where I'm beginning to land a little bit in terms of my sense around this. But I know you've done both, so I'd love to hear a little bit your perspective on this as well.
We have done both, and it's been really interesting to see where the benefit of both options plays out over time. And I think, you know, to your point, there's absolutely there's pros and cons to both. I think that in my experience, or the realization I've come to is, like you said, there's actually a lot of effort in a custom 360. It seems neat on the surface to be able to say, right, we've got a competency framework inside the organization, and therefore let's just create a survey that exactly replicates that and has some of the same wording and so forth. That seems very neat on the surface, but as you pointed out, to provide a really robust and validated tool actually requires a lot more effort than that. It's not just simple throwing down the text and asking whether people believe that or not to a greater or lesser extent. It requires someone who is psychometrically trained, typically an organizational psychologist or someone that is able to translate that into meaningful statements and questions that people can agree on. And secondly, then once that's achieved, that's just the starting point, because then you've got to go off and you've got to validate all of those items and which ones are actually providing useful information. There are some items, for example, that you will see in customized 360s where each one just gets a rating of 5, and so the point is, you know, what is the point to that? Yeah. So I think where I've seen the benefit of the off-the-shelf is that usually they are really well validated. So you've got norms, you've got benchmarks, the ability to compare against a variety of, you know, big sample sizes of other managers, and the comparison is useful, the robustness is useful, because they've worked out all the kinks, they've worked out all of the questions that matter and the ones that don't. But where a custom 360 is useful, I think, is if you do have scale, like you mentioned, if you've got volume and you're prepared to put in the time to ensure that the psychometric properties of the tool are valid, it can be a really useful adjunct to the competency framework that the organization has.
Yeah, Yeah, with you on that. And brings me to the third question. And actually, it's not even the question really, because it's often almost always overlooked. Because every time we run a 360 program, it is in an organization, you know, we put a lot of energy and effort on getting the participant ready, and then working with the manager and the HR to identify who should be the raters. And a lot of our energies are focused on getting the participant ready. But we almost always overlook rater training or support for the raters, and really the data is coming from the raters, and we know, you know, there's always biases and all creep in. And I know Winsboro has often done some very interesting stuff around it. So again, I'm going to invite you to just say a little bit around that. I know I've seen some of the cheat sheets and handouts that sometimes you've prepared. I know it can get, again, very intensive from having so many, you know, logistically challenging. But just if there are any insights to share with us as we think about this area?
Sure, it is a really, in a lot of ways, I've found this kind of a funny issue over the years, because it does matter, as you said, you know, the way that raters rate really does matter, and yet the irony is it's so hard to get an individual that's coming in to rate someone. It's really hard to get them to pay attention to how they should be rating. You know, everyone's busy and they just click on the link and they're away and so forth. So we have tried in the past. We've in the survey invitations we've put links to cheat sheets and things like that, and some people click on them and it's really useful. Just sort of common sense stuff explaining about how to rate. You know, base it on your own observations, not on hearsay or gossip or things that other people have told you. Try and use the range of the scale rather than just kind of one end, that, you know, they're fantastic and you mark them 5. So all of those sort of basic sort of things. We've also, in other surveys, we've knowing that people will often not click on the link in an invite, as we've put those instructions inside a survey, so in the opening page or at the top of a section and so forth. And all of those work for some people and not others. I think the biggest thing that has struck me is really about, again, going back to the programmatic way that we do it. So if you're doing it inside an organization that's part of a leadership program and it's being used by a range of people, that's your biggest opportunity. It's the ability to connect with those people as a group and as a cohort before they do the surveys, and say, hey, look, this is how, just a few easy tips about how to rate people and some of those sort of things, because then everyone hears it at the same time. It's part of the messaging internally that goes with it, and then so when people turn up to the survey, they're more likely to follow that. But it is fascinating, because if you've had, anyone who's had experience with 360s will know this, but often we give people a rating scale of between 1 and 5, and the reality around the globe, without exception, is that people tend to use the 3 to 5. You know, it's 3, 4, or 5. So if you start getting 1s and 2s, you really know that you haven't done a great job. So that restriction of range is problematic, but the more that you can sort of educate people on how to respond and how to be, you know, provide narrative and text that's productive and so forth, it just helps, I think, drive the insight at the other end. It's more useful for the individual. The other thing that I think is interesting beyond the rater training is about selecting who goes into the survey. So sometimes the participant does that. We say, look, you've got to choose 6 to 12 people. There'll be a mix of your peers and your direct reports. Or sometimes it's organisationally delivered. These are the people that are going to be part of it. But what really matters, I think, is choosing a range of individuals that will give some really good feedback, you know, some good, honest feedback that helps us understand how we are seen, and that can offset or counter, I think, a little bit of the rater training. But it is important, as much as you can do it. I think it's useful, and if it becomes part of the language internally for how the organisation's using it, then all the better. It just sort of makes up for a lot of that, the restriction of range and so forth that we see in 360s.
Yeah, great, wonderful. Yeah, because it is observational data we're getting, so we need to, put some energy behind who gets into the survey, who are your raters. Good. Well, I'm going to pause and sort of, check with Ambika. We maybe a few questions, if any, have come in. So Ambika, if you can maybe unmute and either start, asking us those questions.
Hi everybody, we have the first question. What is the time gap between the pre-program and post-program assessment? This is a question from Deepa Shankar.
Oh, Deepa, so for that program that I was talking about, that was a 6-month program. What we did though is we delayed the post-program 360 for a couple of months as well. So the gap between them doing it at the start and doing it at the end was somewhere between 8 to 10 months. I think, my honest opinion is that that is quite a short time frame, and that was the nature of the program. We wanted to give them with quite immediate feedback on their development. When we do that a little bit more systematically, if we're running 360s for organizations, my recommendation is typically between 12 to 18 months for a cycle. And the reason for that is, as we know, behavior change takes a little while. It's not an overnight thing. And sometimes it's not just about the behavior change, but about letting the new reputation for that skill or capability to settle with the people around that are rating. So for that program, it was a bit shorter, but typically for us, the cycle is around sort of the 12 to 18 month mark.
Okay. The next question, can you elaborate on the tracking development, the post 360-degree and personality assessment, and linking to the ROI? This is a question from Aarti Venkatesh.
Yes, so the ROI, I think, is just going back, and it sort of might relate to the question just been, but is about trying to understand from an organization's perspective when they put a program in place, and whether it includes 360s, there'll be other things going on, other sessions and workshops and expertise and learning. One of the biggest challenges that organizations have is how to establish the ROI on that. What is the return on investment? We've paid for these speakers and these sessions and these 360s and tools and things. How can we establish what the ROI is? So the ability to see the impact in those areas that I was talking about in that particular organization was about relationships, and it was about leadership. Those were two areas that the organization had identified and why they were embarking on the program in the first place. They had been given quite direct feedback from some external stakeholders that they weren't good at relationships, that was a customer service, in effect, was a problem, and internally engagement was not particularly high, so they knew they had high turnover and things like that. So that the ability to see in real time where the impact of the program was having was really useful for them. Arguably it might be different for different organizations, it might be in different areas, but for them that was a really strong message that the reason they'd embarked on this program in the first place was because of the communication issues and because of the engagement leadership issues, and you could see quite directly in the pre and post that was the two that had the greatest uplift. So that was great feedback for the executive team, because they just hadn't really had anything like that before.
Okay. Thank you for that answer, Gus. The next question is, in the example of the manager for whom 2 360 surveys were done, the number of respondents were different. Hence, how important is it to have a consistent set of respondents? In some roles, people have a very limited number of peers and direct reports, like a chief architect in a product company. Question from Gayatri.
I think it's a really good question. The reality is, the fewer numbers you've got, the greater degree of variability, or if you really want to think about it from a psychometric perspective, the greater degree of error you have. So if, for example, a practical answer to that is if you had 3 individuals in your, being a bit extreme, you had 3 individuals in your 360 survey and one of them was very unhappy with you for some reason, then that's clearly going to skew the results. If you have between sort of, ideal for me is around sort of the 10 to 12 mark, but you know, that's not always possible. When you, it doesn't matter too much, I think, whether the number of respondents is different from a pre and post perspective, as long as there is a number of individuals that have been able to respond, because you know, people change, it's not always the same people in the team and so forth. But as long as there is a decent number. We do some 360s for people that have fewer, so I think, for example, when you get down to sort of 5 or 6, it's not a huge amount of people in there. When we brief that back to the individuals, we have that conversation with them, and sometimes the results might look a little bit extreme, and we say to them quite explicitly in the feedback, so we've got fewer numbers for you in this particular survey, so we need to take that into account. Let's look a little bit at the narrative that's coming through there as well to try and understand it. But we're not going to put as much stock in the fact that the result is the way it is because there's fewer numbers. So I think you don't, in an ideal world you'd have a few more. I think 30, frankly, is probably too many. I don't think you need that many. 12 to 15 for me is ideal. But if you have fewer, which is sometimes the case, I think it's just the way that you kind of interpret that for them and help them work through that conversation.
Yeah, and Gus, just hopping on to that, it's true because sometimes, and some companies, especially technology companies where I worked in the past, they have got individual contributor 360s which are a little different, but the end of it, it comes to what you're saying. You need to have, if you have more raters, you get a little bit more robust data. The other thing, of course, in most, all surveys, all 360 surveys will set up a minimum number of people, both to protect the confidentiality as well as to have a psychometric reliability to the information you have. And so what happens easy enough is that you then just collapse across the category. What you miss out on is the ability to have the finer distinction between how are my peers seeing versus directs. But what you are able to see is how am I seeing myself, how is my manager seeing me, and how are people around me seeing. So at least you get that sort of 2-3 different perspectives. What you end up losing is, when you don't have enough raters, is this finer distinction which sometimes you're able to get when you have more number of raters, and have got the data on. So guys, I know a lot of other questions have come in, but just in the interest of time, what I thought would do is just keep moving along. I just want to summarize real quick. As I promised people, this is the ThreeFish Leader 360, which we are beginning to use in India. A lot of support and partnership with Winsboro. As you'll see, it's simple, direct. The simplicity is the elegance of it. It's really complexity distilled out, but just gives you exactly the information that you need. As I used to say to Gus, and I work with all these 20-page 360s, but I bring it down to no more than 8 or 10 pages that I use. And that's exactly what's reflected in this ThreeFish 360 that we have. Dual perspective in outer view. Statistically validated, again with partnership with Winsboro, we have global benchmarks, and we've got actionable insights. Right? And essentially, just to quickly then summarize and wrap up our presentation. Oh yeah, sorry, just quick, yeah, what Gus was referring to. The 360, we get into the 4 domains: how you behave, how you relate, how you lead, how you think and plan. And there are 10 competencies, 40 different questions that help you get a sense around these domains, and that can easily get mapped out to most competency models that organizations have. So just quick wrap up. The real question to ask yourself is 360 feedback survey for me, for us. As Gus said earlier, and as we've been talking about, be clear about your purpose. What are you using it for? Then begin to assess the readiness of your organization. And some of the questions for readiness are around, is the top management aligned and supportive? Are they going to be sponsors of the program? Is the organizational culture supportive? What levels of organization will participate on it? Are individuals going to be singled out, or is there a way to assess is it going to be used for assessment of performance? How are the results going to be treated from a confidentiality perspective? Is it standalone program, or is it part of a larger development program? It can be used both. And in the past, I've sometimes used the 360 itself as sort of the center point of an entire leadership development initiative that you've done, that are built around it. So clearly, just need to know how you're going to be using it. As we worked on it, some of the critical success factors I've seen, what sort of makes it or breaks it is, again, getting back to the purpose. What is it about? Upfront setting some very clear confidentiality parameters. Who's going to see the data? How's the data going to be used? Communicate, communicate, communicate. Really, communicate the purpose, communicate to the participants, communicate to the managers, communicate to the raters. Use a well-designed survey, off-the-shelf or custom. It's really the design and the robustness that's important. Now, beyond that, though, report feedback and debrief is very critical to achieve their developmental goals around it. Because end of the day, the 360s are a way to convert insights into actionable development plans and drive behavioral change. So real quick, in summary, 360 feedback works. That's where we started. Does it work? Don't take my word for it. Don't take Gus's word for it. Try it in your own organization. And some of you probably already done that, and actually I would think using it. But it works very well. It's a great way to build awareness and to drive leadership development. They can be used for development as well as talent management. The key to success is a well-designed survey, transparency around the process, use of data, and also offering that developmental support to the participants once the survey is done. Otherwise, it just becomes a logistical activity of some form filling and, box ticking. For me personally, I think custom 360s require substantial investments. The ROI around that may be limited, and off-the-shelf 360s tend to be fairly effective. So with that, I want to say thank you, Gus, for joining us today and for sharing your insights with us. Really good to have you. And I think I'll just put Gus on mute, so I'm going to unmute that. But as I was saying, thank you.
You're welcome, Pradnya. I really appreciate the opportunity. It was great to speak to you.
Wonderful. So I'm going to hand this over to Ambika to just formally close out the webinar then.
Thank you all for your time in attending this webinar on 360-degree feedback for leadership development. Dear Gus and Pradnya, thank you so much for your time and taking us through this presentation. On this note, I would like to call a close on this webinar. Do watch out for more news on the upcoming webinars of ThreeFish Consulting. Thank you all. Good day.